The Duke of Ravencourt had never considered himself a cruel man. Cruelty required intention, passion, some form of emotional investment, and Lord Sebastian Thornfield possessed none of these towards his wife. What he offered instead was something far more devastating, absolute impenetrable indifference wrapped in flawless courtesy. At 34, Sebastian commanded respect throughout Yorkshire and beyond, his vast holdings stretching across 3 counties, his investments in railways and shipping making him one of the wealthiest peers in England. Men sought his counsel in Parliament. Mothers paraded their daughters before him at every conceivable gathering before his marriage. His very presence could alter the atmosphere of a room. Yet none of this power, this influence, had prepared him for the peculiar discomfort of actually sharing his life with another person. He had wed Lady Marianne Ashworth 4 years ago, in a transaction as clean and emotionless as any business arrangement he had ever concluded. She was the daughter of an earl, impeccably bred, educated at the finest schools, possessed of a dowry that was respectable rather than remarkable. The marriage had been universally approved, 2 ancient families united, fortunes consolidated, bloodlines preserved. That Marianne had eyes like warm amber, and a voice that carried the slightest musical lilt when she read aloud, had been irrelevant details he had noted and promptly dismissed. Their wedding night had been a study in obligation fulfilled. Sebastian had performed his duty with the same mechanical efficiency he applied to estate management, then retreated to his own chambers, establishing a pattern that would define their marriage. Separate rooms, separate lives, connected only by the thinnest threads of social necessity. Marianne had arrived at Thornfield Hall, the principal seat of the Ravencourt Duchy, a sprawling Elizabethan manor in the North Riding, with what Sebastian dimly recognized as optimism. She had rearranged flowers in the morning room, asked the housekeeper about his favorite dishes, attempted to engage him in conversation over dinners that stretched into excruciating silence. For perhaps 6 months, she had persisted in these small invasions of his carefully constructed solitude. He had responded to each gesture with impeccable politeness and absolute emotional vacancy. When she asked about his day, he provided facts devoid of feeling. When she suggested they walk the gardens together, he invented pressing correspondence. When she appeared in his study with tea and tentative smiles, he thanked her with the same tone he used for the servants and returned immediately to his ledgers. The ton had noticed, naturally. Society thrived on such observations. At balls and dinners, hostesses seated them together with pointed determination, creating opportunities for a warmth that never materialized. Sebastian would offer his arm, dance when protocol demanded it, and maintain throughout a facade of marital contentment, so practiced that only those watching closely might see the way his wife's smile never quite reached her eyes, or how she had learned to stop reaching for his hand. Lord Ashworth, Marianne's father, had spoken to him once, 2 years into the marriage, after a particularly awkward dinner party where Marianne had excused herself early, citing a headache that fooled no one. "She is my daughter, Ravencourt," the Earl had said quietly, cornering Sebastian in the library. "My only daughter. I gave her to you in good faith." "And she wants for nothing," Sebastian had replied, his voice carrying that infuriating calm that he wielded like armor. "She has every comfort, every luxury. Her position is beyond reproach. Everything except a husband who acknowledges her existence beyond the requirements of propriety." Sebastian had met the older man's gaze without flinching. "I have fulfilled every obligation of our agreement. The marriage contract specified estates, settlements, and heirs. It made no mention of sentiment." Lord Ashworth had looked at him with something between pity and disgust. "You are making her disappear, Thornfield. Slowly, quietly, but just as surely as if you had locked her in a tower." The words had struck something deep that Sebastian had no intention of examining. He had offered more brandy, changed the subject to railway investments, and considered the matter closed. What Sebastian did not acknowledge, even to himself, was that his coldness was not natural but constructed. There had been warmth in him once before tragedy had taught him that feeling deeply meant hurting deeply. His mother had died when he was 12, wasting away from a fever, while his father fell apart so completely that the duchy had nearly collapsed. Sebastian had watched his father, a man he had considered invincible, become a ghost, wandering the halls speaking to shadows, forgetting to eat, eventually drinking himself to death within 3 years of his wife's burial. The lesson had been carved into Sebastian's soul with brutal clarity. Love made you weak, vulnerable, half alive. Better to feel nothing than to risk that devastation. So he had built walls, high and thick, and retreated behind them so thoroughly that he had almost convinced himself the walls were his natural state rather than his prison. Marianne had long since stopped trying to scale those walls. By the 4th year of their marriage, she had learned the choreography of their shared life. Appear at breakfast, exchange pleasantries of stunning banality, occupy separate spheres throughout the day, reunite for dinner with conversation that never ventured beyond weather and household minutiae, retire to separate chambers. She had become a ghost in her own home, moving through rooms like morning mist, present but insubstantial. She had also grown beautiful in a way Sebastian refused to notice. The girl who had arrived at Thornfield Hall had matured into a woman of quiet dignity, her initial brightness refined into something deeper, more mysterious. She wore her loneliness like a cloak, elegant and concealing. The servants adored her. She was unfailingly kind, remembered their children's names, inquired after illnesses with genuine concern. The tenants spoke of her warmth when she visited their cottages. Everyone, it seemed, was permitted to see her humanity, except her husband. The morning everything changed began like any other. October had settled over Yorkshire with its particular brand of grey melancholy, morning mist clinging to the moorlands, the first frost silvering the gardens. Sebastian had risen at 6, as always, dealt with correspondence, reviewed accounts, and appeared at breakfast precisely at 8. Marianne was already there, as she always was, dressed in a morning gown of deep green that he did not allow himself to notice complemented her colouring. She was reading a letter, her expression unreadable. "Good morning," he said, the words automatic. "Good morning, Your Grace," she replied, just as automatic. They had not used Christian names in private for over 2 years. He served himself from the sideboard, kippers, toast, marmalade, and seated himself at the opposite end of the table, a distance of some 12 feet that might as well have been 12 miles. The silence stretched, comfortable for him, suffocating for anyone with the capacity to feel its weight. "I shall be riding out to inspect the northern farms today," he announced, because some conversation was required. "The harvest reports have been concerning." "I hope you find matters more satisfactory than anticipated," Marianne said to her teacup. More silence. The clock ticked. Rain began pattering against the windows. "Will you require the carriage for any calls today?" he asked. Another routine question. Something flickered across her face, gone too quickly for him to interpret. "No, Your Grace. I shall remain at home." He nodded, returned to his newspaper, and considered the interaction complete. What Sebastian did not see, because he had trained himself not to see, was the way his wife's hands trembled slightly as she set down her teacup, or the breath she took before speaking again, a breath that suggested she was gathering courage for something significant. "Sebastian," she said, and the use of his Christian name was so unexpected that his eyes lifted from his newspaper despite himself. She was looking at him. Directly, those amber eyes holding something he could not quite name. For a moment, the briefest moment, something cracked in the wall he had built, and he felt the strangest sensation, almost like recognition, as if he were seeing her for the first time despite 4 years of marriage. "Yes?" The word came out more curtly than he intended, defense against whatever that feeling had been. Marianne studied him with an expression that might have been sadness or might have been something more final. "Nothing," she said at last. "Forgive me, I forgot what I meant to say." The crack sealed. Relief flooded him, relief that he recognized as cowardice but chose not to examine. "Quite all right. The morning is early yet." She rose from the table, suddenly, with a grace that seemed practiced. "If you will excuse me, I have matters to attend to." He stood, as courtesy demanded, nodded, and watched her leave. The door closed with a soft click that sounded, though he did not recognize it, like a decision being made. Sebastian returned to his newspaper, to his breakfast, to his routine. He finished his meal, spent an hour in his study, then departed for his inspection of the northern farms, exactly as planned. The day proceeded with the ordered precision he found comforting. He would not understand until much later, until it was almost too late, that the click of that door, the trembling of those hands, the way his wife had said his name after years of "Your Grace," all of it had been a farewell. By the time he returned to Thornfield Hall that evening, muddy and tired from a day in the saddle, Marianne had already begun dismantling the quiet life she had built in the spaces he had refused to occupy. In her chambers, a trunk stood open. In her eyes, when she heard his footsteps in the corridor and stilled like a deer sensing danger, there was no hope left at all, only resolution. And Sebastian, walking past her closed door without pausing, without knocking, without the slightest curiosity about his wife's day, had no idea that he had just walked past the moment when his carefully controlled life began to collapse. Sebastian Thornfield had not always been carved from ice. There had been a time, brief and distant now, when he had been different, a boy who laughed easily, who ran through Thornfield's corridors with reckless energy, who believed that the world was fundamentally safe and that the people you loved would always remain. His mother, Lady Eleanor Thornfield, had been the warmth at the center of his childhood. She had been unconventional for a duchess. She painted, composed music, read him poetry unsuitable for children about gods and heroes and tragic love. She had taught him to notice beauty, the way light fell through stained glass, the architecture of snowflakes, the precise shade of twilight in autumn. Every evening before bed, regardless of his father's disapproval, she would come to his nursery and they would talk about everything and nothing, his studies, her paintings, the stories they invented together about the portraits in the gallery. "You have a heart that feels deeply, Sebastian," she had told him once, when he was perhaps 11. "Never be ashamed of that. The world will try to teach you that feeling is weakness. The world is wrong." She had died 6 months later. The fever had come suddenly, viciously. Within 3 days, she went from vibrant presence to delirium to silence. Sebastian, kept from her sick room by frantic servants, and a father unraveling in real time, had heard her calling for him through the walls. They would not let him enter. By the time they relented, she was gone, and he was left with nothing but the memory of her voice and the crushing knowledge that love meant loss. His father, the 6th Duke, had not survived her death in any meaningful way. Oh, his body continued for 3 more years, but the man Sebastian had known, stern but fair, commanding, unshakable, vanished the moment they laid Eleanor in the family crypt. What remained was a husk that drank, that wept in empty rooms, that sometimes called Sebastian by his mother's name. The duchy's affairs fell into chaos. Servants whispered. Creditors circled. Sebastian, at 12, then 13, then 14, watched his father destroy himself with grief. The final night when Sebastian was 15, his father had summoned him to the library. The older man was drunk, as he always was by then, his eyes red-rimmed and distant. "You think me weak," his father had said, not accusingly but as a statement of fact. "No, father." Sebastian had learned by then to say the expected thing. "You should." His father had poured another brandy with shaking hands. "I am weak. Your mother unmade me. She was my heart. And when she died, she took it with her. Do you understand what I'm telling you, boy?" Sebastian had understood perfectly, though he wished he had not. "Love nothing that you cannot bear to lose," his father had continued. The words slurring, but the meaning crystal clear. "Or better yet, love nothing at all. We Thornfields feel too deeply. It is our curse. Better to be stone than to be me." 3 weeks later, his father was found dead in his chambers, the brandy bottle empty beside him. The physicians called it heart failure. Sebastian called it the inevitable conclusion of caring too much. At 15, Sebastian had inherited a dukedom in disarray and a lesson burned into his very bones. Attachment led to destruction. So he had rebuilt Thornfield's fortunes by rebuilding himself into something that could not be hurt because it could not feel. He had studied his accounts instead of poetry, had dismissed his mother's paintings to storage, had learned to conduct every interaction as a transaction, to meet every situation with the emotional involvement of a marble bust. By the time he reached manhood, the transformation was complete. The boy who had cried for his mother had been buried so deeply that Sebastian sometimes wondered if he had ever truly existed. What remained was efficient, controlled, impervious, a duke who managed his holdings brilliantly, and his heart not at all. Marriage had been inevitable, an obligation of his position. He had approached the selection of a wife with the same methodology he applied to purchasing livestock: bloodline, temperament, suitability to purpose. Marianne Ashworth had met every criterion. That she was beautiful had been irrelevant. That she possessed intelligence, humor, warmth, these were qualities he had noted and immediately categorized as immaterial to the arrangement. The wedding had been everything it should be, and Sebastian had felt nothing beyond a vague satisfaction at having fulfilled another duty. Their wedding night had been mechanical. He had never learned nor wished to learn the art of intimacy, only its basic mechanics. He had completed what was required and retreated immediately to his own chambers, already calculating the minimum frequency necessary to produce an heir while maximizing his solitude. What he had not anticipated was Marianne's persistence. She had not accepted the terms of their arrangement as meekly as he had assumed she would. For months she had tried to reach him, and for months he had deflected every attempt with the skill of long practice. But there had been moments, small fissures in his armor, that he had immediately plastered over. The first time he had heard her laugh, genuinely laugh at something absurd the vicar had said during a dinner party. Something had shifted uncomfortably in his chest. He had left the room. When he had come upon her in the library, reading the same Tennyson his mother had loved, her lips moving slightly with the words, he had felt an echo of something dangerous. He had made an excuse and avoided the library for a month. The most threatening moment had come at the end of their first year of marriage. He had fallen ill with influenza, rare for him, and had been confined to bed with fever. Marianne had ignored his protests and nursed him herself, sitting by his bedside with cool compresses and quiet presence. In his delirium, he had thought she was his mother returned, had reached for her hand and held it like a drowning man holds driftwood. When the fever broke and he found himself holding his wife's hand while she slept in the chair beside him, exhausted from her vigil, he had felt terror, pure, visceral terror, because in that moment he had been vulnerable, had needed her, had perhaps even begun to. He had released her hand as if burned. When she woke, he had thanked her with cold formality and requested that in future such matters be left to the household staff. The hurt in her eyes had been evident, but he had ignored it as one ignores a draft from a poorly sealed window, something to be noted and dismissed. After that, he had redoubled his defenses. Every kindness she offered was met with politeness, so rigid it became rejection. Every attempt at genuine conversation was redirected to mundane topics or ended with his hasty departure. He had become masterful at the art of present absence, physically there, emotionally nowhere. What Sebastian did not admit to himself was that this required constant effort, that every night, alone in his chambers, he was aware of her presence just down the corridor, that sometimes he would find himself outside her door, hand raised to knock, before sanity reasserted itself and he retreated. That when she played the pianoforte in the music room, he would find excuses to walk past just to hear those few notes before catching himself and changing direction. The truth he could not acknowledge was that Marianne frightened him precisely because she mattered. She had slipped past his defenses simply by existing in his orbit, by being consistently kind when he was consistently cold, by maintaining her dignity when he offered her nothing but emptiness. He sensed, though he would never articulate it, that she had the power to do to him what his mother's death had done to his father, unmake him entirely. So he chose prevention. Better to keep her at a distance than to risk attachment. Better to be alone than to be destroyed. Better to hurt her in small daily doses than to open himself to the catastrophic hurt of loving and losing. What he did not realize, in his carefully calculated emotional isolation, was that his wife had already become essential, that he had grown. Accustomed to her presence at breakfast, her quiet movements through the house, the way she always ensured his preferred tea was available, the flowers she placed in his study that he pretended not to notice. She had woven herself into the fabric of his days so subtly that he had not recognized dependency for what it was. Now, returning from the northern farms as October darkness fell over Yorkshire, Sebastian rode through the gates of Thornfield Hall with his usual preoccupation: ledgers to review, correspondence to answer, dinner to endure. He was planning his evening with the precision he applied to everything, already anticipating the moment when he could retreat to his study, that sanctuary where he was required to be nothing but efficient. The house seemed quieter than usual as he entered, though he could not have said why he noticed. Harrison, the butler, took his coat and riding gloves with his customary discretion. "Her Grace?" Sebastian asked, the question automatic. He always asked, another empty ritual of husbandly concern that required no real interest in the answer. Harrison hesitated, so briefly that Sebastian almost missed it. "In her chambers, Your Grace. She requested a tray be sent up. She will not be joining you for dinner." Something in the butler's tone made Sebastian actually look at the man. Harrison had been with the family for 30 years, had served his father, and his expression was carefully neutral in a way that suggested effort. "Is she unwell?" "I could not say, Your Grace. She did not confide in me." Sebastian nodded, dismissed the information as unimportant. Marianne often had headaches, women's complaints, various indispositions that required privacy, and proceeded to his study as planned. He had reports to review from the northern tenant farms, yields that were disappointingly low, decisions to make about winter preparations. He worked through dinner, ate the cold meal that was brought to him, and continued working until nearly midnight. It was only when he finally rose from his desk, his eyes aching from ledgers and lamplight, that he noticed the house had an odd quality to its silence. Not the usual quiet of night, but something different, emptier somehow. He dismissed the fancy as exhaustion and made his way to his chambers. The corridor was dark except for the dim glow of gas lamps turned low. He passed Marianne's door, closed as always, and continued to his own rooms. It was not until he was preparing for bed that the thought occurred to him, unbidden and unwelcome. He had not seen Marianne at all today, not since breakfast, when she had said his name in that odd way, when she had looked at him with that expression he had not wanted to interpret. The thought persisted as he lay in bed, staring at the canopy above him. Why did it matter? They often went full days without seeing each other beyond breakfast and dinner. This was the arrangement they had settled into, the distance he had carefully cultivated. And yet, something was wrong. He could feel it the way one feels a coming storm, a pressure in the air, a quality of light that signals change. But rather than investigate, rather than rise from his bed and knock on her door and ask if all was well, Sebastian did what he had trained himself to do. He ignored the instinct. He closed his eyes. He willed himself to sleep. He did not hear the soft sounds from her chambers, drawers opening and closing, the rustle of fabric, the quiet, methodical work of someone making preparations. He did not see the way Marianne sat on the edge of her bed near dawn, her packed trunks beside her, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes dry but distant as she said goodbye to the life she had tried so hard to build. Sebastian slept, and in sleeping missed the last chance to reach for her before she let go entirely. When he woke the next morning, everything would be different, though he did not know it yet. The careful distance he had constructed, the emotional fortress he had built to protect himself, all of it was about to crumble, because Marianne had finally learned what he had never taught himself, that sometimes the only way to survive is to walk away from what is killing you, even if you love it. Especially if you love it. The first indication that something fundamental had shifted came at breakfast the following morning, though Sebastian, in his customary obliviousness to anything requiring emotional perception, did not recognize it as such. Marianne was not in the dining room. This in itself was not unprecedented. She occasionally breakfasted in her chambers when feeling poorly, but something about the quality of her absence felt different. The room seemed larger without her quiet presence, the silence more oppressive. Sebastian frowned at her empty chair, experienced a flicker of something almost like concern, and promptly dismissed it as he served himself from the sideboard. Harrison appeared with the Morning Post on a silver salver, his expression maintaining that carefully neutral quality from the previous evening. "Her Grace?" Sebastian inquired, accepting his correspondence without looking up. "She has already breakfasted, Your Grace, in her chambers." "I see she is feeling unwell?" "I could not say, Your Grace. She appeared quite well when I saw her. She was, Harrison paused with uncharacteristic uncertainty, occupied with correspondence. Sebastian nodded dismissively and turned, his attention to his own letters. Among the usual bills and agricultural reports was an invitation that made him pause. Lord and Lady Hartwick were hosting an autumn ball at Hartwick Park, their estate some 20 miles distant. Such invitations were common, and Sebastian typically found excuses to decline. Balls required extensive social interaction, dancing, conversation with people he neither knew nor cared to know. But this invitation was for Saturday next, and Lady Hartwick had added a personal note. "Do bring the Duchess, Your Grace. We have been far too long without her company, and I understand she has become quite accomplished at the pianoforte. We should be delighted if she would favor us with a performance." Something about the note irritated him, though he could not have said why. The presumption that Marianne would wish to perform, perhaps, or the casual mention of an accomplishment he had been aware of only in the most abstract sense. Yes, he occasionally heard music from the music room, but he had trained himself not to pay attention, not to be drawn by something as dangerous as beauty. He set the invitation aside and thought no more of it until that evening, when Marianne appeared at dinner for the first time since the previous morning. She entered the dining room with her usual grace, dressed in a gown of midnight blue that he definitely did not notice, brought out the gold in her eyes, her expression serene and utterly unreadable. "Good evening, Your Grace," she said, her voice carrying none of the warmth that used to color even that formal address. "Good evening," he stood as courtesy demanded, waiting until she was seated before resuming his own seat. "I trust you are feeling better." "Better?" Her eyebrow raised fractionally. "I have been quite well, thank you. Harrison indicated you breakfasted in your chambers." "Yes. I required privacy for my correspondence." She accepted soup from a footman with a slight smile that was not directed at Sebastian. "I hope my absence did not inconvenience you." There was something in her tone, not quite sarcasm, not quite indifference, but something new and faintly unsettling. Sebastian studied her across the expanse of table, seeing perhaps for the first time in months, years, the woman who sat opposite him. When had she become so contained, so self-possessed? The girl who had arrived at Thornfield Hall 4 years ago with anxious hope in her eyes had been replaced by someone harder to read, someone who looked at him as one might look at a stranger, whose presence required acknowledgement but not interest. "Not at all," he said finally. "I merely wished to ensure you were well." How considerate! The words were perfectly appropriate. The tone was not. They ate in silence for several minutes, the scrape of silver against china seeming louder than usual. Sebastian found himself unusually aware of the distance between them, the 12 feet of polished mahogany that might as well have been a continent. When had she stopped trying to bridge that distance? He could not pinpoint the moment, realized with dim discomfort that he had not noticed the transition from her active attempts at connection to this cool, courteous indifference. "I received an invitation today," he said, surprising himself by breaking the silence. "Lord and Lady Hartwick. An autumn ball Saturday next." Marianne's hands stilled for the briefest moment before resuming their task of cutting pheasant. "How? Lovely for you. For us, we are both invited." "Are we?" She looked up then, her eyes meeting his directly in a way that made him oddly uncomfortable. "And do you intend to accept?" "I had not decided. I typically find such gatherings tedious." "Then by all means decline." She returned her attention to her plate. "I am certain the Hartwicks will understand. Lady Hartwick specifically requested your presence. She mentioned your skill at the pianoforte." Now Marianne did smile, but it was a strange smile, edged with something he could not interpret. "Did she? How thoughtful of her to remember what my own husband does not know." The words landed like a slap, all the more effective for being delivered with perfect composure. Sebastian felt heat rising to his face, embarrassment, anger, something else he refused to examine. "I am aware that you play," he said stiffly. "Are you?" She tilted her head slightly, studying him with what might have been curiosity, or might have been pity. "Tell me, Your Grace, what do I play? What composers do I prefer? Do I favor Mozart or Beethoven? Do I sight read or play from memory? Do I practice in the mornings or the evenings?" He had no answers. The realization sat heavily in his chest, unwelcome and undeniable. He heard music from the music room, yes, but he had never listened, never allowed himself to be curious about the person creating those sounds. "I thought not," Marianne said softly when his silence stretched too long. "But please do not trouble yourself. It is precisely as things have always been." She rose from the table abruptly, her meal barely touched. Sebastian stood automatically, trained by years of protocol. "If you will excuse me, Your Grace, I find I am not as hungry as I thought. I believe I shall retire early." "Marianne?" Her Christian name felt strange on his tongue after so many months of formal address. She paused at the door, her back to him. "Yes?" He had nothing to say, no explanation that would not require acknowledging the past 4 years of calculated neglect, no apology that would not mean admitting fault, admitting feeling, admitting that her words had struck something he had thought safely buried. "Never mind. Sleep well." She left without another word, and Sebastian stood alone in the dining room, feeling for the first time in years something uncomfortably close to shame. Against his better judgment, against every instinct that told him to decline and retreat further into his comfortable isolation, Sebastian accepted the Hartwick's invitation. He told himself it was merely duty. They were neighbors. Refusing would be rude. His absence would be noted. He did not examine why it suddenly mattered to him that Marianne had been specifically requested, or why the thought of her playing for an audience that would appreciate her talent when he had not bothered to stir something dark in his chest. The week leading to the ball passed in a strange new tension. Marianne had become a ghost in truth now, present at meals but offering nothing beyond polite responses to direct questions. She no longer initiated conversation, no longer tried to fill the silences with observations about the weather or the gardens or the tenants. She simply existed in his proximity, serene and distant as a portrait. Sebastian found this more disturbing than he cared to admit. The old Marianne, with her gentle persistence and barely concealed hurt, had been uncomfortable but familiar. This new version, this woman who looked through him rather than at him, who moved through Thornfield Hall with the detachment of a guest preparing to depart, unnerved him in ways he could not articulate. He caught himself, more than once, manufacturing reasons to be in rooms she occupied. He would need a book from the library precisely when she was reading there. He would remember urgent business in the morning room when she was writing letters. Each time she would look up, acknowledge him with perfect courtesy, and return to her occupation without the slightest indication that his presence mattered to her in any way. It was maddening. And Sebastian, who prided himself on never being mad about anything, found his famous control beginning to fray. Saturday arrived with the crisp clarity of late October, the moorlands painted in burgundy and gold, the sky impossibly blue. They departed for Hartwick Park in the ducal carriage at 5 o'clock, Sebastian in his formal evening attire. Marianne, in a gown of deep garnet silk that he absolutely did not notice, made her skin glow like porcelain, and her eyes seem larger, more luminous. The journey of 20 miles might as well have been 20 miles of Arctic silence. Marianne sat opposite him, her gaze fixed on the passing landscape, her hands folded serenely in her lap. Sebastian attempted several times to initiate conversation, comments about the weather, the state of the roads, the likelihood of rain, and received responses so brief and disinterested that he eventually subsided into his own silence, scowling at nothing in particular. Hartwick Park blazed with light as they approached, every window illuminated, carriages lined up along the curved drive, the sounds of music and laughter spilling into the autumn evening. Lord Hartwick, a jovial man in his 50s, with the complexion of someone who spent more time hunting than in ballrooms, greeted them warmly at the entrance. "Raven Court, delighted you could attend. We had quite despaired of ever seeing you at our gatherings." He turned to Marianne with considerably more enthusiasm. "And your Grace, Lady Hartwick has spoken of nothing but your promised performance all week. She has positioned the pianoforte in the music room specifically to ensure optimal acoustics." Marianne smiled and Sebastian experienced a shock of recognition. It was genuine, warm, nothing like the polite masks she wore for him. "You are too kind, Lord Hartwick. I hope I shall not disappoint." "Impossible. I understand from Lady Ashworth that you are extraordinarily accomplished. Your mother writes to Lady Hartwick regularly, you know, and speaks of your talent with great pride." Something flickered across Marianne's face. Pleasure at the mention of her mother, perhaps, or pain at the reminder of family who noticed and valued her when her husband did not. Sebastian felt that uncomfortable heat again, that sensation he refused to name as guilt. They entered the ballroom, and Sebastian's discomfort intensified immediately. He had forgotten how oppressive these affairs were, the press of bodies, the cacophony of conversation and music, the expectation of charm and sociability. He moved through the crowd with Marianne at his side, accepting greetings, making appropriate responses, counting the minutes until he could reasonably retreat to the card room or the library or anywhere less suffocating. But something prevented his usual escape. Perhaps it was the way men's eyes followed Marianne as they moved through the room. Perhaps it was the realization that she was, objectively, the most beautiful woman present, and that beauty had been wasted on him, existed in his house like a painting he never looked at. Perhaps it was simply that he had become aware of her in a way he had successfully avoided for 4 years, and now he could not stop noticing. Lord Pemberton approached, a widower in his late 30s, wealthy and well-regarded, with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to female attention. "Your Grace," he addressed Sebastian with appropriate respect, before turning immediately to Marianne. "And Your Grace. How splendid to see you. It has been far too long since London, has it not?" "Lord Pemberton." Marianne's smile was warm, her tone pleased. "Indeed, I believe it was the Westmorelands' dinner party in the spring." "Just so. You were seated beside me, and we had that fascinating discussion about the lake poets. I have since read that volume. Of Wordsworth you recommended, The Prelude. Quite extraordinary." They continued conversing about poetry, about London, about mutual acquaintances, and Sebastian stood beside his wife like a piece of furniture, contributing nothing, understanding with growing irritation that Pemberton had cultivated more genuine conversation with Marianne in 5 minutes than Sebastian had managed in 4 years. "I understand you are to perform for us this evening," Pemberton was saying, his attention entirely on Marianne. "I confess I have been anticipating it since Lady Hartwick mentioned it. I heard you play once, you know, at the Devonishes Musicale 2 years ago. Chopin, if memory serves. It was—" He paused, searching for the right word. "Transcendent." Marianne's cheeks colored with pleasure, and Sebastian felt something new and deeply unpleasant coil in his stomach. He had never made her blush like that, had never known what music she played at London musicales, had never attended such events with her, had never cared enough to be present for moments that brought that light to her eyes. "You are too generous, Lord Pemberton," Marianne said softly. "Not at all. I confess I have hoped for another opportunity to hear you play." Pemberton's voice carried an undertone that Sebastian, even in his emotional obtuseness, recognized as something more than polite interest. "Perhaps when you return to London for the season?" "Perhaps," Marianne said, non-committal, her eyes flicking. Briefly to Sebastian before returning to Pemberton. The arrival of Lady Hartwick provided an excuse to extract Marianne from Pemberton's company, though Sebastian was not certain why he felt relief at the separation. Lady Hartwick swept Marianne away with talk of the evening's program, and Sebastian was left alone with Pemberton, who smiled with infuriating pleasantness. "You are a fortunate man, Ravencourt," Pemberton said, watching Marianne's retreating figure. "The Duchess is remarkable. Intelligent, accomplished, gracious. One wonders—" He trailed off deliberately. "Wonders what?" Sebastian's voice was colder than he intended. Pemberton met his eyes with an expression of studied innocence that did not quite mask the calculation beneath. "Only why we see so little of her in society. Such qualities should not be kept hidden, should they? One might almost think you wished to keep her to yourself." The implication hung in the air between them, polite on the surface, barbed underneath. Sebastian recognized it for what it was, a challenge, a suggestion that he did not properly value what he possessed, an indication that other men had noticed and would be happy to offer the appreciation he withheld. "The Duchess prefers the country," Sebastian said flatly. "Does she?" Pemberton's tone suggested polite skepticism. "How curious. In London she always seemed to enjoy society greatly, but perhaps things are different in Yorkshire." He moved away before Sebastian could respond, leaving him standing alone with a champagne glass he did not remember accepting, and a feeling in his chest that he finally, reluctantly, recognized for what it was: jealousy. The realization appalled him. He had no right to jealousy. He had given Marianne nothing, no attention, no affection, no reason to believe her husband cared whether she existed or vanished. If Pemberton saw what he had been blind to, if Pemberton valued what he had ignored, that was merely logic asserting itself. One did not hold on to something and simultaneously refuse to acknowledge possessing it. And yet, the evening progressed toward Marianne's performance, and Sebastian found himself unable to settle, unable to lose himself in cards or business conversation as he usually did at such events. He remained in the ballroom, positioned where he could observe his wife without being obvious about it, watching as she moved through the social rituals he had never bothered to share with her. She was radiant, was the word that came unwillingly to mind. In her element in ways she never was at Thornfield Hall, laughing genuinely at something Lady Westmore said, engaged in animated discussion with a cluster of women near the windows, accepting compliments with gracious modesty. This was the woman he had married and then systematically ignored. This was what he had been missing while he buried himself in ledgers and agricultural reports. The thought brought no satisfaction, only a gnawing discomfort that grew stronger as the evening wore on. When Lady Hartwick finally announced the musical program, the guests assembled in the music room, a magnificent space with soaring ceilings and perfect acoustics. The pianoforte had been positioned to command the room, and Marianne moved toward it with visible composure that Sebastian suspected concealed nervousness. She seated herself, arranged her skirts, and placed her hands on the keys with the confidence of extensive practice. For a moment, she sat, perfectly still, her eyes closed, gathering herself. Then she began to play. The music that filled the room was Beethoven. Sebastian recognized it dimly from somewhere in his past, before he had taught himself not to hear such things. The Pathétique Sonata, passionate and melancholy and technically demanding. But it was not the technical proficiency that arrested his attention, though that was evident. It was the emotion poured into every note, the way Marianne's entire being seemed to channel into the music, giving it a depth and intensity that made the room hold its collective breath. He had not known. He had not known she possessed this, that she could create such beauty, that she had been living in his house for 4 years with this extraordinary gift, and he had never once asked to hear it, had never shown the slightest interest in this essential part of who she was. The shame that had been building all evening crystallized into something acute and painful. He watched his wife's hands move across the keys, watched her face in profile as she played, lost in the music in a way she was never lost in his presence, giving to this room full of near strangers what she had long since stopped trying to give to him, her truest self. When the final notes faded, the silence lasted a heartbeat before applause erupted, genuine and enthusiastic. Marianne rose, curtsied, accepted the acclaim with flushed cheeks and shining eyes, and Sebastian, standing at the back of the room, understood with terrible clarity that he had committed a crime beyond mere neglect. He had taken something precious and acted as if it were worthless. He had driven away warmth with coldness, genuine feeling with calculated indifference. And Lord Pemberton, moving immediately to Marianne's side as she stepped away from the pianoforte, offering his arm, his compliments, his complete and obvious attention, Pemberton knew her value, knew it, and made no attempt to hide his regard. Sebastian watched them together, watched the way Pemberton leaned close to say something that made Marianne laugh, and the jealousy he had been denying blazed into something stronger. He wanted to cross the room, separate them, claim his wife through proximity, if not affection, but he remained frozen, trapped by years of self-imposed distance, unable to bridge in an instant the chasm he had spent 4 years excavating. The evening continued around him, but Sebastian saw none of it. He saw only Marianne with Pemberton, Marianne surrounded by admirers who appreciated what he had scorned, Marianne existing in a world he had never bothered to enter, but which welcomed her gladly in his absence. The ride home was another exercise in Arctic silence, but this time the silence originated from Sebastian rather than Marianne. He was grappling with too many realizations, all of them uncomfortable, all of them pointing toward a truth he had avoided for years. His wife had slipped through his fingers, not through any action of hers but through his determined refusal to hold on. When they arrived at Thornfield Hall, Marianne murmured a quiet good night and disappeared up the stairs with obvious relief. Sebastian retreated to his study, poured himself a brandy he did not want, and sat in darkness while the hours crept toward dawn. Somewhere in the house, his wife was removing the garnet gown, unpinning her hair, preparing for bed. And for the first time in their marriage, Sebastian desperately wished he had. The right to be there, to tell her how extraordinary she had been, to apologize for 4 years of blindness. But he had forfeited that right through systematic neglect, and now, sitting alone with his jealousy and his shame and his too-late recognition, he understood that he had perhaps forfeited it irrevocably. The worst part was knowing he had no one to blame but himself. The morning after the Hartwick ball dawned grey and cold, frost silvering the Yorkshire moors, the kind of November morning that made even Thornfield Hall's massive fireplaces seem inadequate. Sebastian had not slept. He had remained in his study until the sky lightened, wrestling with thoughts that refused to be organized into his usual neat categories of problem and solution. The jealousy from the previous evening had not faded with darkness, had not been rationalized away by his usual mental discipline. If anything, it had intensified. Complicated by other feelings he lacked the vocabulary to name. Regret, perhaps, or shame, or the belated recognition of value in something he had dismissed as inconsequential. Marianne's face, as she played, lost in music while surrounded by people who appreciated her gifts. Pemberton's obvious regard, the way he had looked at her with undisguised admiration, the realization that other men saw what Sebastian had trained himself not to see, all of it circled in his mind like birds of prey, tearing at the comfortable detachment he had cultivated for so long. He found himself, as dawn broke, standing outside Marianne's door, his hand raised to knock. The corridor was silent, the household not yet stirring. He could knock. He could speak to her. Tell her, what? That he had suddenly noticed her existence after 4 years of studied indifference. That he objected to Lord Pemberton's attention despite having forfeited any right to such objection. That her performance had moved him, though he had never bothered to hear her play before. Any words he might offer seemed inadequate, clumsy, too little and too late. His hand remained suspended in air, frozen by uncertainty that was itself foreign to him. Sebastian never hesitated. Hesitation implied doubt, and doubt was a luxury he had long ago decided he could not afford. He lowered his hand and walked away. At breakfast, Marianne appeared as usual, though something in her expression seemed different. More resolved, perhaps, or simply more distant. She was dressed for travel in a practical day dress of deep green, and there was something in the set of her shoulders that suggested purpose. "Good morning, Your Grace," she said, taking her seat. "Good morning." He studied her across the table, searching for words that might bridge the 12 feet of mahogany and the 4 years of cultivated separation. "You played beautifully last evening. I did not know you were so accomplished." She looked at him then, directly, and her expression was unreadable. "Thank you. Though I wonder how you could—" "No, given that you have never asked me to play, never attended any performance I've given, never shown the slightest interest in whether I played at all." The words were not angry. They were simply factual, which somehow made them worse. "I regret that," Sebastian said stiffly, the admission costing more than he expected. "It was remiss of me." "Remiss?" She repeated the word as if tasting it, finding it inadequate. "Yes, that is certainly one way to describe 4 years of comprehensive indifference." The silence that followed was different from their usual silences, charged, heavy with things unsaid for too long. Sebastian felt something cracking in his chest, that carefully constructed wall showing its first real fissures. "Marianne," he stopped, uncertain how to continue. He had no practice in this, in genuine conversation that required vulnerability. All his words were armor, deflection, the language of transactions, and emotional distance. "Sebastian," she set down her teacup with deliberate precision. "I am leaving Thornfield Hall today." The words did not immediately make sense. Leaving for where? A visit to her parents? Shopping in York? He stared at her, uncomprehending. "I am returning to my father's house in Hertfordshire," she continued, her voice steady. "I have already written to inform them, A carriage will arrive this afternoon. Leaving? The word finally penetrated. For how long? Indefinitely. She met his eyes without flinching. I am leaving. You, Sebastian. Or rather, I am ceasing to live in the fiction that we have a marriage in any meaningful sense of the word. The crack in his chest widened, something cold flooding in. You cannot simply leave. Can I not? Her eyebrow raised slightly. You have been absent from our marriage for 4 years. I am merely making that absence physical as well as emotional. Surely you, who have made such an art of my non-existence, should welcome the convenience of my actual departure. This is absurd. He stood, the chair scraping against the floor. You are my wife. In name only. She remained seated, maddeningly calm. Tell me, Sebastian, what exactly would change in your life if I were not here? You do not speak to me beyond basic courtesy. You do not share meals with any real companionship. You maintain separate chambers. You take no interest in my activities, my thoughts, my existence beyond what is required for the most minimal appearance of propriety. What, precisely, would you miss about my presence? He had no answer. The realization was devastating. She was right. He had constructed his life at Thornfield Hall to function as if he were unmarried, as if the woman across from him were a particularly permanent houseguest rather than his wife. Her departure would change nothing in his daily routine, because he had ensured she occupied no genuine space in that routine. The scandal, he began. Ah, yes, the scandal. Marianne's smile was bitter. Your concern for my welfare is touching, though I note it manifests only when my actions might reflect poorly on you. The scandal of a wife living separately from her husband is unfortunate, but I suggest it is no worse than the scandal of a husband treating his wife with such obvious indifference that all of society whispers about it. Lord Pemberton mentioned it last evening, you know. How strange it was that I never attended London events with you. How curious that you and I seemed to barely acknowledge each other's existence. The mention of Pemberton sent heat through Sebastian, anger, jealousy, something more complicated. Pemberton had no business. Pemberton was kind. Her voice sharpened. He was kind, Sebastian. He spoke to me as if I were a person, rather than an obligation. He asked about my interests and listened to my answers. He complimented my playing because he had actually bothered to listen to it. These are not remarkable acts of devotion. They are the basic courtesies that any person might extend to another. And yet they felt extraordinary because you have never, not once in 4 years, offered me even that much. Sebastian gripped the back of his chair, his knuckles white. The truth of her words was undeniable, but accepting them meant accepting his own culpability, acknowledging the systematic cruelty of his indifference. I provided for you, he said, the words sounding weak even to his own ears. You have wanted for nothing, except a husband. Marianne stood now, gathering her composure around her like armor. Except companionship, conversation, the basic human warmth that even servants in this house receive from each other. I have wanted for nothing material, Sebastian. I have wanted for everything that matters. You knew the terms of our arrangement. He was grasping now, desperate, though he could not have said what he was desperate for. This was not a love match. We both understood. I understood nothing. Her voice finally broke, just slightly, showing the emotion beneath the calm. I was 19 years old. I believed that marriage meant partnership, that even without romantic love, we might build something resembling friendship. I believed that you were merely reserved, that given time, you might warm to me. I tried, Sebastian. For over a year I tried everything I could think of to reach you, and you responded to every attempt with such consistent coldness that I finally understood. You did not want a wife. You wanted a title holder, someone to manage your household and eventually provide heirs while requiring nothing from you emotionally. That is not... But he could not finish the sentence because it was not untrue. I have been dying here. The words were quiet but absolute. Slowly, quietly, dying of loneliness in a house full of people, married to a man who looks through me as if I were glass. I have tried to content myself with music, with reading, with managing the household, with visiting tenants. But contentment is not the same as living, Sebastian, and I cannot do this anymore. I will not. She moved toward the door and panic seized him. Actual panic, an emotion he had not felt since childhood, since his mother's fever, since his father's disintegration. The thought of Marianne leaving, of Thornfield Hall without her presence, of his life continuing in the empty pattern he had established, but now revealed as the lonely horror it had always been, it was suddenly unbearable. "Marianne, wait." He rounded the table, reaching for her arm. "Please, let us discuss this rationally." She stopped but did not turn. "There is nothing rational to discuss. I am not negotiating. I am informing you of a decision I have already made. You cannot just abandon our marriage." His hand on her arm tightened, not painfully but desperately. Now she did turn, and her eyes were bright with unshed tears that she refused to let fall. "I am not abandoning it, Sebastian. You abandoned it 4 years ago. I am simply, finally accepting that abandonment as the permanent state you clearly intended it to be." "That is not what I intended." The words burst from him, unplanned, raw. "I never intended—" "What did you intend?" She pulled her arm free, but gently. "What was your goal in treating me with such meticulous indifference? What did you hope to achieve by ensuring that I felt less welcome in this house than the scullery maid?" He had no answer that would not require excavating his father's ruin, his mother's death, the lessons he had learned about love and loss and the necessity of emotional fortification. He had no answer that would not mean revealing the fear that had governed his life since he was 15 years old. He stopped, started again. "I did not want to—" "To what?" When he remained silent, she nodded, as if confirming something to herself. "You cannot even say it. You cannot articulate what you feel, what you fear, what you want. You are locked so tightly inside yourself that there is no room for anyone else, and I cannot continue to live as a ghost in your periphery, hoping that someday you might notice I exist." "I notice." The admission felt like tearing something vital. "I have always noticed." She studied him with an expression that might have been pity. "Then that makes it worse, doesn't it? If you noticed and still chose to treat me as you have, then it was not neglect, but deliberate cruelty." "I had hoped it was neglect, Sebastian. Cruelty would mean there is nothing to salvage." "It was not cruelty." He was floundering, desperate, his usual articulate command of language deserting him utterly. "It was protection." "Protection?" She laughed, but without humor. "Protection for whom?" "For both of us." The words came from somewhere deep and unexamined. "For you from my inadequacy. For me from—" He stopped, unable to continue. "From what?" She moved closer, and he could smell her perfume, something with lavender that he had trained himself not to notice. "From caring, from feeling, from the possibility that you might actually have to be vulnerable with another human being." The accuracy of her analysis was devastating. He stood before her, the Duke of Ravencourt, master of vast holdings and considerable fortune, reduced to silence by his wife's clear-eyed assessment of his cowardice. "I watched my father destroy himself loving my mother," he said finally, the confession dragged from some locked chamber. "I watched him become nothing. After she died, I swore I would never allow myself to be that vulnerable." Understanding flickered across Marianne's face, but it did not soften her resolve. "So you chose to feel nothing instead, and in protecting yourself you destroyed us both. You do not have half of a marriage, Sebastian. You have no marriage at all, and you never have. We could—" He reached for her again, and she stepped back, creating distance that felt final. "We could try again. I could try." "Try what?" "To pretend. These 4 years did not happen. To act as if you did not systematically teach me that my presence in your life was at best an inconvenience to be tolerated. I am not a project you can suddenly decide to attend to, Sebastian. I am a person who has spent 4 years being erased by your indifference. And I am done. Please." The word was foreign in his mouth, desperation making him honest in ways he had never allowed himself to be. "Please do not leave. Give me one reason to stay." She waited, her eyes holding his. "One genuine reason that is not about scandal or duty, or the inconvenience of separation. Tell me why I should remain in a marriage that has brought me nothing but loneliness." He opened his mouth, closed it again. The reasons crowded his throat because I notice you more than I have admitted, because your absence will hollow out this house, because the thought of Pemberton or anyone else offering you the attention I have withheld makes me want to break things, because I am afraid of what your leaving means about the waste I have made of both our lives. But he could not say any of it. The words required vulnerability he had spent 20 years learning to avoid. They required admitting need, acknowledging feeling, tearing down walls he had built with such determination that they had become load-bearing structures of his identity. The silence stretched. Marianne watched him struggle, and something in her expression shifted from hope to resignation. "I thought not," she said softly. "You cannot even offer me that much, a single honest feeling expressed without armor." She turned and walked to the door. This time, he did not try to stop her. He stood frozen, trapped in the prison of his own making, while she paused in the doorway. "For what it is worth," she said without turning back, "I did love you, Sebastian. Or I loved who I hoped you might become if you ever allowed yourself to be human. That is the saddest part of all of this. Not what we were, but what we might have been if you had been brave enough to try." She left. The door closed, and Sebastian remained standing in the empty dining room, surrounded by the wreckage of his own choices, understanding too late that the walls he had built to protect himself had not kept him safe at all. They had merely kept him alone. The house felt different after Marianne left. Sebastian told himself this was imagination, that Thornfield Hall remained exactly as it had always been, the same furniture, the same servants moving through their duties, the same routine he had cultivated so carefully. Yet something essential had shifted, as if the air itself had thinned, making each breath slightly more difficult than it should be. He had not stopped her departure. He had stood at his study window and watched the carriage pull away down the long drive, her trunk strapped to the back, and had done absolutely nothing. Pride had kept him there, pride and the paralyzing fear that any action he took would only confirm what she had said, that he was incapable of genuine feeling, locked so deeply within himself that connection was impossible. The first week passed in a fog of routine. Sebastian threw himself into estate business with even more determination than usual, rising before dawn, working until well past midnight. The northern farms needed attention. The investments required review. There were tenants to visit, accounts to audit, correspondence to answer. He filled every hour with activity, leaving no space for thought, no room for the uncomfortable awareness that had taken root in his chest since the morning she left. But Thornfield Hall conspired against his denial. Everywhere he turned, there were reminders of the presence he had ignored for 4 years and now could not stop noticing. The morning room where she had taken her tea, always positioned to catch the best light for reading. The garden paths she had walked each afternoon, her footprints still visible in the damp earth. The music room, its door closed now, the pianoforte silent. The servants noticed, of course, they said nothing. Well-trained staff knew better than to comment on their employers' domestic arrangements. But Sebastian caught the looks exchanged between Mrs. Hendricks, the housekeeper, and Harrison. Pity, perhaps, or judgment. Both were equally unbearable. On the 8th day, Lord Ashworth arrived unannounced. Marianne's father was shown into the library, where Sebastian was attempting to focus on agricultural reports and failing utterly. The Earl looked older than Sebastian remembered, his face lined with an anger that was all the more effective for being tightly controlled. Ravencourt. No honorifics, no courtesy, simply cold acknowledgement. Lord Ashworth. Sebastian stood, bracing himself. I did not expect— No, I imagine you did not expect to face the father of the woman you have driven from her own home. Ashworth moved further into the room, his eyes hard. My daughter arrived at my house a week ago. Do you know what state she was in? Sebastian said nothing. There was nothing to say that would not make things worse. Composed, Ashworth continued, his voice brittle with restrained fury. Perfectly composed, calm, rational. She explained the situation with such careful lack of emotion that my wife wept, though Marianne herself did not shed a single tear. Do you understand what that means, Ravencourt? What you have done to her? I understand that she was unhappy. The words were inadequate, but they were all Sebastian had. Unhappy. Ashworth's laugh was harsh. She was dying, you fool, slowly suffocating in a marriage to a man who treated her with less consideration than he would give a horse. Unhappy does not begin to describe the systematic destruction of a young woman's spirit that I witnessed when she walked through my door. The words landed like physical blows. Sebastian gripped the edge of his desk, needing the solid reality of wood beneath his hands. "I never intended," he began. "Your intentions are irrelevant." Ashworth cut him off with a sharp gesture. "Your actions are what matter. 4 years, Ravencourt. 4 years you had my daughter under your roof, and you could not manage even basic human kindness. What manner of man does that? What manner of husband?" "A careful one." The answer came from that deep, defended place. "A man who learned that attachment leads to devastation." "So instead you chose to devastate someone else," Ashworth moved closer, his voice dropping to something more dangerous than shouting. "You chose to protect yourself by destroying her? That is not carefulness, Ravencourt. That is cowardice of the most contemptible kind." The word struck home because it was true. Coward. He had been hiding behind the excuse of protection, of learning from his father's mistakes, but in truth he had simply been afraid. Afraid to feel, afraid to risk, afraid to be vulnerable enough that loss might matter. "What would you have me do?" Sebastian heard himself ask, and hated the weakness in his voice. "I would have you leave her alone." Ashworth's eyes were cold. "You have already taken 4 years of her life. Do not compound the injury by attempting to draw her back into your emotional wasteland now that you have finally noticed her absence. She is my wife, in name only, and you made it so. If you have any decency at all, you will let her go. Petition for separation if you must, on grounds of incompatibility. I will not fight it. Neither will she. Give her back her freedom, since you never valued the gift of her presence." The Earl turned to leave, then paused at the door. "My daughter deserves better than you, Ravencourt. She always did. I should never have agreed to this marriage. That is my failure, and I will live with it. But I will not allow you to hurt her further. Stay away from her." He left, and Sebastian sank into his chair, Ashworth's words echoing in the sudden silence. "Stay away from her. Let her go. She deserves better than you." All of it true, all of it unbearable. November bled into December. The moorlands turned harsh and beautiful, frost hardening the ground, the sky taking on that peculiar grey quality of approaching winter. Sebastian moved through his days like a man under water, everything muffled and distant, his carefully constructed routine revealed as the empty thing it had always been. He found himself, against all logic, spending time in the rooms Marianne had occupied. The morning room where her embroidery still lay abandoned on a side table, the threads she had been working in shades of blue and gold, the library where her reading chair remained positioned by the window, a bookmark still holding a place in a volume of Keats she had not finished, the music room where he finally, weeks too late, opened the pianoforte and stared at the keys she had touched, imagining her hands moving across them with the grace and emotion he had witnessed at the Hartwick ball. He tried once to play. His fingers were clumsy, unpracticed, producing discordant sounds that made him close the instrument quickly, ashamed. She had possessed this gift, this ability to create beauty, and he had never once asked her to share it with him. The realization of what he had wasted grew heavier with each passing day. Not just her music, but everything she might have offered if he had been willing to receive it. Conversation, companionship, warmth in a house that had been cold since his mother's death. She had arrived at Thornfield Hall with hope, with the generous assumption that their arranged marriage might become something real, and he had systematically destroyed that hope through calculated indifference. Letters arrived from London, invitations to the winter season, business correspondence, the usual social obligations. Among them, one from Lady Hartwick, expressing concern at the rumours circulating about the Duke and Duchess of Ravencourt living separately, hoping that all was well, mentioning almost casually that Lord Pemberton had been making inquiries about her Grace's health and circumstances. Sebastian read that line multiple times, feeling the jealousy surge again, hot and irrational. Pemberton, who had spoken to Marianne with obvious regard, who had looked at her the way Sebastian had never allowed himself to look. Pemberton, who might even now be in Hertfordshire, calling on the Ashworths, offering Marianne the attention and appreciation that her husband had withheld. The thought made him physically ill. He tried to bury himself deeper in work, but concentration eluded him. He would find himself staring at nothing, replaying conversations with Marianne, the few genuine ones they had ever had. Her words in the dining room that final morning played on an endless loop. "I did love you, Sebastian, or I loved who I hoped you might become if you ever allowed yourself to be human." Past tense. Had loved. No longer. He had. Killed whatever she had felt through systematic neglect, and now he was left with the ashes of something he had never properly valued when it was alive. December brought heavy snows to Yorkshire, blanketing the moors in white, isolating Thornfield Hall further. Sebastian stood at his window one evening, watching snow fall in the darkness, and found himself remembering his mother. Not the fever and the death, but before, the way she had looked at his father with such love, such complete devotion. The way his father had returned that love with an openness that had seemed, to Sebastian's adult understanding, recklessly vulnerable. His father had been destroyed by that love, yes, but he had also been made whole by it, had lived with a fullness and joy that Sebastian, in all his careful control, had never experienced. His father had loved completely, and when that love was taken from him, he had shattered. But at least he had loved. At least he had known connection, intimacy, the profound, human experience of being truly known by another person. Sebastian had chosen safety over risk, control over feeling, and what had it gained him? An empty house, a hollow life, and the loss of a woman he had never properly appreciated until she was gone. The realization that had been building for weeks finally crystallized into something clear and terrible. He had made the wrong choice. Not in marrying Marianne, that had been the one thing he had done right, though entirely by accident, but in responding to that marriage with such determined emotional absence. He had been given a gift and had treated it as an obligation. He had been offered love and had responded with indifference. And now it was too late. Or was it? The question lodged in his mind, persistent and uncomfortable. Ashworth had told him to stay away, and Sebastian's pride agreed. What right did he have to pursue Marianne now, after everything he had done? What possible words could bridge 4 years of systematic cruelty? Through neglect. But another part of him, a part that had been silent for so long he had forgotten it existed, whispered differently, that he owed her more than absence, that he owed her the truth of what he felt, even if that truth was too late to matter, that she deserved to know she had not been worthless, but rather so valuable that he had been terrified by the power she held over him. He had been a coward. Ashworth had been right about that, but there were different kinds of cowardice. There was the cowardice of emotional withdrawal, which he had already committed, and there was the cowardice of accepting defeat without fighting, of allowing his fear to have the final word. If he went to her now, she might reject him, probably would reject him, and justly. She might tell him that his sudden awareness was too late, too convenient, too obviously a response to loss rather than appreciation. She might look at him with the same distant courtesy she had worn like armor in those final weeks at Thornfield Hall, and he would have no defense, no argument against her coldness, because he had taught her that coldness himself. But at least he would have tried. At least he would have been honest, vulnerable, willing to risk the pain he had spent his adult life avoiding. At least he would have offered her what he had never given before, the truth of his feelings, unarmored and uncalculated. The decision, once made, brought a clarity that was itself terrifying. He would go to Hertfordshire. He would face Marianne and her father and whatever judgment they chose to render. He would tell her what he should have told her years ago, that she mattered, that his indifference had been fear rather than lack of feeling, that he had been wrong in every way a man could be wrong. She might send him away, she probably would send him away, but he would accept that outcome if it came, would grant her the separation she requested, would release her from a marriage that had brought her only pain. But first he would fight for her, not with pride or control or any of the weapons he had used to keep her at a distance, but with the only thing he had never given her, absolute, terrifying honesty. Sebastian stood at the window, watching snow fall over the Yorkshire moors, and felt something crack open in his chest, something that had been sealed since he was 15 years old, since his father's death, since he had decided that feeling was too dangerous to permit. It hurt. God. It hurt more than he had imagined possible, this sudden rush of emotion after years of numbness. But for the first time in 2 decades, Sebastian Thornfield, allowed himself to feel without immediately constructing defenses against the feeling. He felt the loss of his mother, never properly mourned. He felt the waste of his father's final years. He felt the 4 years he had stolen from Marianne through his cowardice. He felt the loneliness of the life he had constructed so carefully, revealed, now as a prison rather than a fortress. And beneath all of it, tentative but growing stronger, he felt something that might have been hope. Not hope that Marianne would forgive him. He had no right to expect forgiveness. But hope that he might finally become the man she had once believed he could be, if only he allowed himself to be human. The snow continued falling, blanketing Thornfield Hall in white, and Sebastian made his plans. He would leave in the morning, as soon as the roads permitted. He would go to Hertfordshire, to the Ashworth estate, and he would do what he should have done 4 years ago. He would see his wife, truly see her, and he would tell her the truth. Whatever came after, he would face it. But he would not be a coward anymore. Even if courage came too late, it was better than the alternative of never trying at all. The journey to Hertfordshire took 3 days through December snow and frozen roads. Sebastian travelled alone, having dismissed his valet's protests that a duke should not arrive at another peer's estate without proper attendance. This was not a social call, requiring the full regalia of his position. This was something far more essential and far more humble, a man attempting to repair damage he had spent 4 years creating. The Ashworth estate emerged from winter landscape like something from a painting. Tudor architecture softened by snow, smoke rising from multiple chimneys, lights glowing golden in windows against the gathering dusk. Sebastian had been here once before, years ago, for the negotiations preceding his marriage to Marianne. He had approached it then with cool calculation, evaluating the property with the same detachment he had brought to evaluating his future bride. Now, staring at those lit windows, and knowing Marianne was somewhere within, he felt his carefully prepared composure beginning to fracture. The butler who answered his knock looked shocked to see him, though training quickly smoothed the expression into professional neutrality. "Your Grace, we were not expecting— I wish to see my wife." The words came out more forcefully than Sebastian intended. "Please inform her that I am here. Her Grace is—" The butler hesitated, clearly uncertain how to handle a situation unprecedented in his experience. "Perhaps it would be best if I announced you to Lord Ashworth first." "No." Sebastian stepped into the entrance hall, not quite forcing his way in, but making clear he would not be easily dismissed. "I wish to see my wife, now if possible." Voices carried from somewhere in the house, female laughter, lighter than Sebastian had heard in years, followed by the deeper tones of Lord Ashworth, saying something that provoked more amusement. The sound struck Sebastian with unexpected force. Marianne was laughing, genuinely laughing, in a way she never had at Thornfield Hall. The confirmation of what her life had been with him, so devoid of joy that even basic laughter had been impossible, settled like lead in his stomach. Lord Ashworth appeared in the doorway of what was clearly a family drawing room, his expression transforming from pleasant to thunderous the moment he saw Sebastian. "Ravencourt, what the devil are you doing here?" "I wish to speak with Marianne." "Her Grace," Ashworth corrected coldly, "does not wish to speak with you. I thought I made that clear when I visited Thornfield Hall." "Nevertheless," Sebastian straightened, drawing on the authority of his title not to command but simply to project the determination he felt. "I have travelled 3 days through appalling weather. I will not be turned away without at least the opportunity to—" "To what?" Ashworth moved closer, his voice dropping to a furious whisper. "To hurt her again? To offer empty apologies that change nothing? You have done quite enough damage, Ravencourt. I will not permit you to do more." "Father!" Marianne's voice came from the drawing-room doorway, and every nerve in Sebastian's body went taut. "What is happening? Who is—" She stopped, seeing him. For a moment her expression was completely unguarded. Shock, pain, something that might have been hope before being ruthlessly suppressed. Then the mask descended, that same distant courtesy she had worn in their final weeks together, and Sebastian felt the loss of her openness like a physical blow. "Sebastian, not your Grace." His Christian name, but spoken with no warmth, simply acknowledgement. "I did not expect to see you here." She looked different. Not diminished as he had half feared, but rather more herself, wearing a simple gown of blue wool, her hair arranged less formally than she had worn it at Thornfield Hall, her face showing colour that might have been from the fire's warmth or from riding in the cold. She looked, he realized with a pang, healthy, happy even, in a way she never had in their marriage. Marianne. Her name felt sacred in his mouth, something to be handled carefully. I apologize for the intrusion. I know I have no right to your time or attention, but I had to come. I had to speak with you. There is nothing to say. Her voice was steady, but he heard the effort that steadiness required. You made your position abundantly clear over 4 years. My leaving should not have surprised you. It devastated me. The words fell into silence. Ashworth looked between them, his expression suggesting he wanted to intervene but was uncertain how. Lady Ashworth had appeared behind Marianne, her hand on her daughter's shoulder, protective and concerned. Marianne, Sebastian continued, please, grant me a few minutes of your time. I will accept whatever you decide afterward. If you wish me to leave and never return, I will honor that. But please let me speak with you, privately. She studied him for a long moment, her amber eyes searching his face for something. Whatever she saw there must have surprised her, because her expression shifted, the rigid control, softening slightly into uncertainty. Very well, she said finally. A few minutes in the library. Ashworth made a sound of protest, but Marianne raised a hand. It is my decision, Father. I can hear what he has to say without coming to harm. The library was a smaller, more intimate space than Thornfield Hall's grand version, lined with books and smelling of leather and wood smoke. A fire burned in the grate, and the December darkness pressed against the windows. Marianne moved to stand by the fire, not sitting, maintaining physical distance that was clearly intentional. Sebastian remained near the door, suddenly uncertain how to begin. You look well, he said finally, inadequately. I am well. She folded her hands before her, the gesture defensive. Better than I have been in years, if I am honest. There is something restorative about being in a house where people actually speak to me, where my existence is not treated as an inconvenience to be managed. The barb landed as intended. Sebastian absorbed it without flinching. I deserve that. I deserve far worse than that. Why are you here, Sebastian? She sounded tired now, the distance in her voice edged with something sadder. What could you possibly have to say that would matter at this point? The truth. He took a step forward, then stopped himself, respecting her space. I came to tell you the truth. I should have told you 4 years ago. The truth I have been too much of a coward to acknowledge even to myself until you left. And what truth is that? Her tone suggested she expected more excuses, more deflection. That I was terrified of you, from the moment we married. The confession came raw and unpolished. Terrified of what you represented, what you made me feel, what power you held without even knowing you held it. Marianne's expression shifted, surprise cracking through the careful neutrality. Terrified of me? Sebastian, I was 19 years old and completely powerless in our marriage. What possible threat could I have posed? The threat of mattering. He forced himself to hold her gaze, to not retreat into the comfortable armor of emotional distance. My mother died when I was 12. My father loved her so completely that her death destroyed him. He spent 3 years drinking himself to death because he could not bear to live without her. I watched him disintegrate, Marianne. I watched love turn a strong man into a shell. And so you decided never to love anyone. Her voice was soft now, understanding beginning to dawn. You decided that feeling nothing was safer than risking that kind of loss. Yes. The admission cost him, but he continued. I built walls so high that nothing could touch me. I told myself it was wisdom, learning from my father's mistakes, but it was cowardice, pure, contemptible cowardice. Then why marry at all? She moved slightly closer, drawn despite herself. If you were so determined to feel nothing, why not remain unmarried? Duty, obligation, the need for an heir. He gestured helplessly. I thought I could maintain the same emotional distance in marriage that I maintained in every other aspect of my life. I thought I could have a wife the way one has a competent steward, present but not significant, necessary but not important. That is horrifying. But there was no anger in her words, only sad acknowledgement. It is. He took another step forward, needing her to understand. And it would have worked. Perianne, if you had been different, if you had been cold or calculating or interested only in the material benefits of being a duchess, I could have maintained my distance with someone like that. But I was not like that. No, his voice broke slightly. You were kind. You were patient. You tried so hard to reach me, and every attempt terrified me because I felt myself responding. I felt the walls cracking. And rather than allow that, rather than risk caring about you, I reinforced the walls. I made myself colder, more distant, more determinedly indifferent. Marianne was staring at him now with an expression he could not fully read. Confusion, hurt, anger, but also something that might have been recognition. You are saying that you ignored me, treated me with such comprehensive indifference because you were afraid of caring too much? I am saying that I am a coward who destroyed the best thing that ever happened to him because I was too afraid to acknowledge that it was valuable. The words came faster now, desperate. I am saying that every time you smiled at me, I felt something crack inside. Every time you tried to speak with me, I wanted to respond with honesty and warmth and every human impulse I had buried. So I did not respond at all because not responding felt safer than risking attachment. Sebastian, she pressed her fingers to her temples, clearly struggling to process this. Do you understand how that sounds? You are telling me that you hurt me, systematically for 4 years, not because you did not care, but because you cared too much. I am telling you that I was wrong. He moved closer still, close enough to see the firelight reflected in her eyes. Profoundly, inexcusably wrong. My father's tragedy was not that he loved too deeply. It was that he lost what he loved. The love itself was the only good thing in his life. And I, in my determination not to be destroyed by loss, never allowed myself to have anything worth losing. Until I left. Her voice was barely a whisper. Until you left, he confirmed. And then I understood too late that I had not protected myself from loss at all. I had merely delayed it. Because I lost you, Marianne. Not to death or illness or any of the things I feared, but to my own stubborn refusal to be vulnerable enough to keep you. Tears were sliding down her cheeks now, though she made no sound. Sebastian reached up instinctively to brush them away, then stopped himself, uncertain if he had the right to touch her. She noticed the aborted gesture, and something in her expression softened. You are telling me this now, she said, her voice thick with emotion. After 4 years, after driving me away, after making me feel so worthless that I had to leave to preserve what remained of myself. You are telling me this now. I know. He let his hand drop. I know the timing is unconscionable. I know I have no right to expect anything from you after what I have done. But I could not let. You believe that my indifference was real, Marianne. I could not let you think that you were somehow insufficient, when the truth is that you were too significant. You were everything I was afraid to want. I do not know what to do with this. She turned away, moving to the window, staring out at snow-covered grounds. For 4 years, I believed you simply did not care. I built my entire understanding of our marriage on the foundation of your indifference. And now you are telling me that everything I believed was wrong? Not wrong. He moved to stand behind her, not touching, but close enough to feel her warmth. I was indifferent in action, even if not in feeling. The result was the same. You suffered because of my cowardice. Whether I secretly cared while inflicting that suffering does not absolve me of responsibility for it. No, she agreed, it does not. They stood in silence, the fire crackling behind them, winter darkness beyond the window. Sebastian could see their reflections in the glass. 2 figures standing close but not touching, the space between them filled with 4 years of damage. What do you want from me? Marianne asked finally. Why did you really come here? To tell you the truth. To apologize in a way I never did at Thornfield Hall, and he hesitated, then pushed forward, to ask if there is any possibility, however small, that you might be willing to try again. She turned, and her expression was complicated. Pain and anger, but also longing, hope, fighting with self-protection. Try again? Sebastian, you destroyed my trust. You taught me that I could not rely on you for even basic human warmth. How am I supposed to simply forget that? You are not. He met her eyes directly. I do not expect you to forget, or to trust me immediately, or to grant me forgiveness I have not earned. but I am asking for the opportunity to prove that I can change, that I can be the husband I should have been from the beginning. People do not change, she said, but without conviction. Then I will be the first. He reached for her hand carefully, giving her time to pull away if she wished. She did not. Her fingers were cold, and he enclosed them gently in his own warmth. I cannot undo the past 4 years. I cannot give you back the time I wasted, the hurt I inflicted, but I can offer you honesty going forward. I can promise to spend the rest of my life proving that you matter to me, that you have always mattered, even when I was too broken and afraid to admit it. Pretty words, she whispered, but her hand remained in his. You have always been good with words when necessary, Sebastian. How do I know this is not simply pride speaking? Anger that I left rather than accepting the terms you established? You do not know. He tightened his hold on her hand, desperate to make her understand. You cannot know unless you give me the chance to demonstrate through action rather than words. I'm not asking you to return to Thornfield Hall tomorrow and pretend nothing happened. I'm asking you to let me court you, Marianne. Properly, the way I should have done before we married. Court me? She stared at him. We have been married for 4 years, and I have never courted you. I have never asked about your interests, your dreams, what you think about when you play music, or read poetry, or walk in gardens. I have never tried to know you, Marianne. Let me learn. Let me prove that I can be attentive, present, genuinely interested in who you are, rather than terrified by what you represent. And if I allow this, she said slowly, and you revert to your old patterns, if you hurt me again, then you will leave again, and I will deserve it. He raised her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her fingers that was reverent rather than passionate. But I do not believe I will revert, because living without you these past weeks has been worse than any pain I was trying to avoid. The loneliness I feared if I loved and lost cannot compare to the loneliness of never having truly loved at all. Marianne stood very still, her hand in his, tears still sliding slowly down her cheeks. The fire had burned low, and the room was filled with shadows and the blue light of snow reflecting through windows. When she spoke, her voice was barely audible. I did love you, Sebastian. I loved you even when you gave me no reason to, even when it hurt, even when I knew I should stop. And when I left, I thought I had finally killed that feeling. But standing here now, listening to you say these things I have wanted to hear for 4 years, I do not know what I feel. Then let me help you feel again. He brought his other hand up to cup her face gently, his thumb brushing away tears. Let me court you, care for you, show you every day that you are valued. I cannot promise perfection. I am still learning how to be vulnerable, how to express feeling instead of burying it. But I promise to try. Every day, I will try. I do not know if I can survive being hurt by you again, she whispered. The first time nearly destroyed me. Then I will not hurt you again. He leaned his forehead against hers, the intimacy of the gesture more profound than any physical passion. I swear to you, Marianne, I will spend every day proving that you can trust me, that you can rely on me, that you matter more than my fear, more than my pride, more than any of the defenses I have built. Show me. She pulled back, slightly to look into his eyes. Do not just tell me, Sebastian. Show me. Here now. Give me something that proves this is real, that you are capable of what you promise. He understood what she was asking. Not pretty words or grand gestures, but genuine vulnerability. The thing he had withheld from her throughout their marriage. The thing that terrified him more than anything else. I am afraid, he said softly. Right now, standing here with you. I am more afraid than I have been since I was a boy watching my father fall apart. Because you have the power to hurt me, Marianne. You have always had that power. And admitting that, acknowledging that I need you, that your opinion matters, that your absence has left me hollow, it goes against every instinct I have cultivated since I was 15 years old. Go on, she encouraged gently. I missed you. The words came haltingly, dragged from somewhere deep. Every morning at breakfast, I missed you. The silence was not comfortable anymore. It was suffocating. I missed your voice, your presence, the small things you did that I pretended not to notice, the flowers you placed in my study, the way you ensured my tea was always prepared correctly. The sound of you playing the pianoforte that I would walk past just to hear for a few seconds before forcing myself away. You heard me play? Always. He smiled sadly. I always heard you, Marianne. I simply could not allow myself to acknowledge that I was listening. But after you left, I went to the music room. I opened the pianoforte and tried to play, wanting to understand what you felt when you touched those keys. I was terrible, as I expected, but I understood something in that moment. You were giving beauty to that house, to my life, and I had been too stubborn and afraid to appreciate it. Marianne was crying openly now, but these tears seemed different. Not pain alone, but something more complicated. Relief, perhaps, or the beginning of healing. Say my name, she requested. Suddenly, the way you did this morning when I left Thornfield Hall, you said it once and it sounded different. Say it again. Marianne. He infused the syllables with everything he felt, regret and longing and desperate hope. Marianne, I am so sorry. I am sorry for every day I made you feel invisible. I am sorry for every time I left a room to avoid connection. I am sorry for teaching you to expect nothing from me when you deserved everything. She reached up to touch his face, her fingers, tracing the line of his jaw with a gentleness that undid him completely. I do not know if I can forgive you immediately, she said honestly. The hurt is too deep, too recent. You cannot expect 4 years of damage to be repaired by one conversation, no matter how honest. I know. He turned his head to press a kiss to her palm. I'm not asking for immediate forgiveness. I am asking for the chance to earn it over time. If I agree to this, she said carefully, there will be conditions. I will not return to Thornfield Hall immediately. I will not step back into the same patterns that destroyed me before. If you wish to court me, you will do so properly, calling here, spending time together, learning to actually communicate. And the moment I feel you retreating back into indifference, the moment I sense you building walls again, I will leave, permanently. Understood? Relief flooded through him, so intense it made him dizzy. Any conditions you require, Marianne, I will meet them. All. And you must learn to be honest, she continued, not just in grand moments like this, but in everyday interactions. If something bothers you, say so. If you need time alone, ask for it directly, rather than manufacturing coldness. I can handle honesty, Sebastian. What I cannot handle is the silent rejection that leaves me guessing what I did wrong. I will learn. He pulled her closer, and she allowed it, resting her head against his chest. I am not naturally given to emotional expression. You know this. But I will practice. I will try. And when I fail, because I will fail sometimes, I will accept correction and try harder. They stood like that for several minutes, simply holding each other in the firelight, the silence now comfortable rather than oppressive. Sebastian felt something loosening in his chest, that tight knot of control he had maintained for so long beginning to unravel. It was terrifying. It was also liberating in ways he had not anticipated. I have a confession, Marianne said against his chest, her voice muffled by his coat. When you arrived tonight, my first instinct was joy. Before the hurt and anger, before the protective distance, there was joy. That frightened me because it meant I had not stopped caring as completely as I thought. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? He stroked her hair, marveling at being allowed this simple intimacy. I do not know yet. She pulled back to look at him. Ask me again in 6 months after I have seen whether your actions match your words. 6 months of courtship. He smiled, and it felt strange on his face, this genuine expression of pleasure. I can do that. I will do it so well that you will have no doubt of my sincerity. Sebastian. Her expression turned serious. I need you to understand something. I am not the same woman who arrived at Thornfield Hall 4 years ago. The girl who wanted nothing more than to please you, who measured her worth by your approval. She is gone. I had to kill her to survive. The woman I am now will not accept less than genuine partnership, true respect and honest affection. Good. He cupped her face in both hands, holding her gaze. I do not want that frightened girl back. I want the woman standing before me now, strong enough to leave when she was being destroyed, brave enough to give me another chance despite having every reason not to. This woman, this Marianne, is who I want to know, to court, to eventually deserve if I am very fortunate." She smiled then, tentatively but real, and Sebastian felt something shift in his chest, some final wall crumbling. He leaned down slowly, giving her time to refuse, and pressed his lips to hers in a kiss that was gentle, reverent, nothing like the perfunctory contact of their wedding night. This was a promise, a beginning, an acknowledgement that they were starting over from a place of honesty rather than obligation. When they finally separated, both slightly breathless, Marianne rested her forehead against his. "This will not be easy," she warned. "Rebuilding trust never is." "I know." He held her close, grateful beyond measure for the weight of her in his arms. "But I would rather struggle towards something real than live comfortably in the emotional wasteland I created. You were right that morning at Thornfield Hall. I was not living. I was merely existing. Safely, yes. Carefully, yes. But utterly alone in the middle of a marriage that could have been extraordinary if I had been brave enough to try." "Then try now." She looked up at him, and in her eyes he saw both the hurt he had inflicted and the possibility of something better. "Try every day, Sebastian. That is all I ask. I will." He sealed the promise with another kiss, longer this time, more confident. "I swear to you, Marianne, every day for the rest of our lives, I will try to be worthy of the gift you are giving me." The library door opened, and Lord Ashworth stood in the entrance, his expression caught between hope and deep suspicion. "Marianne, is everything, are you—" "I am well, Father." She stepped back from Sebastian's embrace, but kept hold of his hand, a gesture of unity that made Sebastian's throat tight. "His Grace and I have been speaking. We have reached an understanding." "An understanding?" Ashworth looked between them, clearly uncertain how to interpret his daughter's tear-stained face and obvious emotional turbulence. "What sort of understanding?" "The Duke will be staying in Hertfordshire for a time," Marianne said, her voice gaining strength. "He has proposed a proper courtship with my consent and under your roof. I have agreed to consider reconciliation, provided certain conditions are met." "Marianne, you cannot be serious." Ashworth moved into the room, his concern evident. "After everything he has done, he has been honest with me, Father." She squeezed Sebastian's hand. "More honest than he has ever been. I am not naive. I know that words are easy, and actions are what matter. But I also know that I will regret it if I do not at least allow him the chance to prove he has changed." Ashworth studied them both for a long moment, then sighed heavily. "Very well. If this is truly your choice, I will support it. But understand, Ravencourt," he turned his stern gaze on Sebastian, "you are here on sufferance. One wrong move, one hint of the behavior that drove my daughter away, and I will personally ensure you never set foot in this house again." "Understood." Sebastian met the older man's eyes without flinching. "I appreciate your allowing me this opportunity. I will not waste it." "See that you do not." Ashworth moved to embrace his daughter, kissing her forehead. "I only want your happiness, my dear. If this man can provide it, then I will welcome him. But if he hurts you again, he will not, Father." Marianne said it with more confidence than Sebastian thought he deserved, and he felt the weight of that trust settle over him like a mantle. After Ashworth departed, Marianne and Sebastian remained in the library a while longer, simply talking. Not about anything profound. She told him about her weeks at her parents' estate, the books she had been reading, her plans to visit London in the spring. He shared details about Thornfield Hall, the estate matters that required attention, the way the staff had reacted to her absence with obvious concern. It was, Sebastian realized, the first genuine conversation they had ever had. No walls, no deflection, just two people learning to communicate honestly. It was harder than he had anticipated. Years of emotional guardedness made openness feel dangerous, exposed. But each time he felt himself retreating into formality, he would look at Marianne's face and remember what his distance had cost them both, and he would push through the discomfort to offer genuine response. By the time they finally parted for the evening, Sebastian felt exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical exertion. Emotional honesty, he was discovering, required far more energy than he had imagined. But as he lay in the guest chambers that night, listening to the house settle around him, he also felt something he had not experienced in years: contentment. Not happiness yet. That would require time, proof, the rebuilding of what he had torn down. but contentment in knowing that he had finally chosen courage over cowardice, vulnerability over safety, the risk of loving over the certainty of loneliness. Somewhere in the house, Marianne was also lying awake, processing the evening's revelations. Sebastian hoped she was not regretting her decision, hoped his honesty had not come too late. But even if it had, even if she ultimately decided she could not forgive him, he would always be grateful for this, that he had finally told her the truth, had finally allowed himself to be seen without armor. Whatever came next, he would face it as he should have faced their marriage from the beginning, with an open heart and the willingness to be hurt if that was the price of genuine connection. Outside, snow continued falling over Hertfordshire, blanketing the world in white, covering old tracks and making space for new paths to be forged. And inside Ashworth House, two people who had been strangers in marriage were taking the first tentative steps toward becoming partners in truth. It was a beginning, not a resolution or a happily ever after, because those would need to be earned through time and consistent action, but it was a genuine beginning, built on honesty rather than obligation, on conscious choice rather than arrangement. And for Sebastian Thornfield, Duke of Ravencourt, who had spent 20 years believing that beginnings were merely preludes to inevitable loss, this fragile new start felt like the most valuable thing he had ever possessed, because it was real. And because Marianne, against all odds and despite every reason not to, had decided to give them, the chance to discover what their marriage might become if he finally had the courage to fight for it.